Under a sky washed in golden dust, the wind carried the sound of hooves across the open prairie. It was evening in Willow Creek, a quiet old American village tucked between the rolling hills and the far horizon where the sun bled into the earth. The saloon lamps were just being lit, the blacksmith's hammer had gone silent, and somewhere down the dirt road a wagon creaked to a stop in front of the old chapel. The town had seen weddings before, but none quite like this. Folks leaned on fences, whispering behind calloused hands, watching as the stranger stepped down from his horse and tossed $3 silver into the preacher's palm. He wasn't a poor man, but not rich either, just a lone cowboy whose eyes spoke more than his mouth ever would. Dust clung to his boots and hat brim. His face was sunburned, sharp and silent. Behind him a young girl stood barefoot beside the wagon, her dress plain and worn. Her hands twisted the edge of her shawl, and her wide eyes darted to every corner of the crowd like a bird trapped between fear and disbelief. She didn't know what awaited her, only that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet understand. Word had spread fast that morning. The rancher from Dry Valley had come to town to find himself a bride. Not for love, not for comfort, just for company on his lonely stretch of land where miles of dust met sky, and not a soul lived within shouting distance. The preacher, desperate to keep peace and the church lights burning, had agreed to arrange it. In a place where winters bit hard and women vanished faster than gold, nobody questioned much anymore. Survival came before sentiment. When the girl stepped down, the chatter around her grew quieter. She looked no older than 19, her face young but shadowed with the kind of sorrow that made her seem older. Her mother had died that spring, and her father, God rest him, had gambled away everything they owned. By the time the sheriff came knocking, all that was left to trade was her. And so, in a moment of desperation, the deal was struck. $3 silver, enough to clear her father's debt and buy him one more week of whiskey dreams. The cowboy hadn't said much when he made the offer. He simply looked at her, then at the horizon, and nodded once. The crowd said he was a man who'd lost more than he'd ever spoken about. His ranch burned in the old fire, his brother buried after a bar fight gone wrong. He lived alone with 2 horses and a windmill that groaned in the night. Maybe he wanted a wife to ease the silence. Maybe he just needed another heartbeat under his roof. Inside the chapel, the candles flickered against the cracked walls. The preacher cleared his throat, his voice trembling just enough to betray the unease he felt. The girl stood before the altar, her hands shaking as she held the worn bouquet the preacher's wife had handed her. The cowboy removed his hat, his dark hair falling over his brow as he took a slow step forward. The room smelled of wood smoke and rain-soaked earth, and outside thunder rolled across the hills like distant drums. No one said a word when the preacher began. The girl's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes glistened, not with love, but with confusion. How could she marry a man whose name she barely knew, whose past was a mystery wrapped in silence? The cowboy's voice was low when he finally spoke, rough from years of dust and smoke. "I'll take care of her," he said simply. "That's all there is." The preacher nodded, but his hands hesitated before the final words. Then came the ring, an old silver band, tarnished but whole. The cowboy reached into his pocket and knelt before her to place it on her trembling hand. And that's when it happened. She screamed. It wasn't the cry of fear alone, but of something deeper. The room froze. Even the storm outside seemed to pause for a breath. The cowboy looked up, startled, his hand still outstretched. The girl stepped back, her eyes wide, her voice breaking as she whispered something no one quite heard. Some said it was the look in his eyes, the sudden recognition of a memory she couldn't explain. Others swore they saw a scar on his hand, the same shape as one her brother had once shown her before he vanished years ago. The preacher dropped his Bible. The candles flickered. The cowboy slowly rose to his feet, his jaw tight, his eyes searching hers like he was trying to piece together a puzzle buried under years of silence. The crowd began murmuring again, unsure whether to leave or stay. Outside, the rain started to fall, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the roof of the chapel. The girl backed away, her voice trembling as she said, You're the one who—" But she never finished. The cowboy's expression changed, not angry, not even afraid, just wounded, as if the past had suddenly come back to collect its debt. The preacher tried to calm her, but she shook her head violently. "I can't," she said, her voice cracking. "Not him," and she turned toward the door. The cowboy took a single step forward, his voice low and unsteady. "You don't understand," he said, but the words barely reached her over the sound of the storm. The door swung open with a crash of wind, and she ran out into the rain, barefoot on the muddy road. The cowboy followed, his hat still in his hand, calling after her. The townsfolk spilled out behind them, watching as she disappeared down the road toward the bridge where the river cut through the valley. The preacher's wife clutched her shawl tight, whispering a prayer under her breath. No one knew what had passed between them, only that something in that moment broke the quiet rhythm of Willow Creek. The deal was made. The money paid. But the past had come roaring back in the form of a terrified young bride and a cowboy haunted by something no one could name. By nightfall, the storm had washed away their tracks. The preacher said it was God's way of hiding what wasn't meant to be seen. Others whispered that the girl's scream still echoed down the valley at dusk, carried by the wind that swept across the prairie. And somewhere beyond the line of hills, a lone horse was heard galloping through the rain, chasing something or someone that might never be found again. In Willow Creek, folks still tell the story of that night, how a cowboy paid $3 for a bride, and how she screamed when he knelt. Not out of fear of marriage, but of recognition. Whatever she saw in him that night, whatever truth lingered behind his quiet eyes, it was enough to change both their lives forever. As the dawn rose over the empty road, only the old silver ring remained in the mud by the chapel steps, half buried, waiting for the sun to rise on whatever came next. The rain didn't stop that night. It fell steady and cold over the dirt roads of Willow Creek, washing the dust from the rooftops and turning the fields into long stretches of mud. Lanterns burned late in the windows, and from one house to the next, folks whispered about what had happened in the chapel. No one could sleep. It wasn't every day a bride ran screaming from her own wedding, and it wasn't every day that a man with eyes like storms stood silent under the rain, watching her vanish into the dark. The cowboy didn't go back to the saloon or the boarding house. He stood in front of the chapel long after everyone else had gone inside. The preacher came out once, hat in hand, and told him he ought to find shelter before the lightning caught him. But the cowboy only said, "She's scared of something that ain't me," before turning back toward the road. His horse waited nearby, stomping impatiently in the mud, the saddle dark with rain. By morning, the town woke to silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed-out world that smelled of wet sage and smoke. The cowboy's horse was gone, and so was he. Some said he rode west toward the canyon, where the river cut deep through the stone. Others thought he'd gone back to his ranch in Dry Valley, the lonely stretch of land where the wind never stopped. But a few, those who'd seen his face when the girl screamed, said he'd gone after her, not out of anger, but out of something else entirely. The girl hadn't been seen since. The preacher's wife found the broken bouquet outside the chapel door, the petals scattered and stuck to the wet boards. She took it inside, laid it on the pew, and lit a candle beside it. "No one deserves to start a life that way," she whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at the ring still half buried in the mud outside. By noon, the sheriff rode into town. He was an older man, slow-moving but sharp-eyed, and he'd known the cowboy for years. "Ain't his way to scare a woman," he told the preacher. "He's rough around the edges, sure, but not cruel. Something happened in there that neither of us understand." The preacher nodded, wiping his hands on his coat. "She looked like she'd seen a ghost," he said quietly. Right when he knelt, she went pale as chalk. It's like she knew him from somewhere she shouldn't have. The sheriff tilted his hat back, thinking. Maybe she did. He paused, his voice lowering. "You remember the fire out at Dry Valley? The one burned down the ranch 5 years back?" The preacher nodded. "Took his brother, didn't it?" "Yeah," the sheriff said. "And a girl, too. Some drifter's daughter who'd been working there for the season. No one ever found her after the fire." He looked down the road where the chapel still stood, quiet and empty. "If I didn't know better, I'd say that bride might have been her kin." Out on the plains, the cowboy followed the trail the rain hadn't quite erased. His horse moved slow through the muddy ruts, nose low to the ground. He hadn't slept since the night before, and his thoughts churned as heavy as the clouds still hanging above the hills. He couldn't shake the look in her eyes, the mix of fear and recognition. The way her voice had cracked when she said those words he still couldn't forget. "You're the one who—" The words kept repeating in his head, unfinished but heavy with meaning. He didn't know what she thought he'd done, but something deep inside him told him she wasn't mistaken. Somewhere in the pieces of his past, in the years blurred by smoke and whiskey, there was something he hadn't faced, something that had finally come looking for him. By sundown, he reached the river crossing. The bridge was slick, the boards swollen from rain. Hoofprints marked the mud on the other side, small, barefoot ones beside them. She'd crossed here. He could tell by the way the tracks hesitated halfway, as if she'd stopped to look back. He pulled his horse to a halt and stared across the current, the water dark and quick. "She's out there," he muttered to himself, "and she's scared for a reason." He dismounted and led the horse across, the water licking at the boards beneath them. The sun was low when he reached the far bank, painting the valley gold. A narrow trail wound up into the woods, and there, caught on a branch, he saw a scrap of fabric, part of her shawl, torn and soaked. He folded it in his hand and sighed. In town, the preacher sat by the window of the chapel, writing a letter to the next county's marshal in case trouble followed. The candlelight flickered over his lined face as he wrote of the strange wedding, the scream and the missing pair. His wife came to stand beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You think he'll hurt her?" she asked softly. The preacher shook his head. "No, but I think there's something between them neither of us can fix." That night, the wind rose again, sweeping through the valley like a restless spirit. Coyotes called from the hills, and the old mill by the creek creaked in the gusts. In the darkness, the girl huddled inside an abandoned cabin, her dress still damp, her eyes swollen from crying. She'd found the place by accident, half collapsed but dry, its chimney still standing. A faint fire burned in the hearth from the wood she'd gathered. She sat near it, staring into the flames, trying to make sense of what had happened. She couldn't stop shaking. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face again. His eyes, the scar on his hand, the sound of his voice when he said, "I'll take care of her." It wasn't that she didn't believe him. It was that she couldn't. Because the scar on that hand was the same one she'd seen years ago, the night her brother had been shot outside a burning barn. The memory hit her hard. The glow of fire against the night sky, the shouting, the horses panicking in their stalls. She'd been only 14 then, hiding behind a wagon, too scared to move. She'd seen a man run from the flames, blood on his face, and her brother chasing him. A shot had rung out, and when she found her brother's body later, he was holding a broken pocket knife with an engraving, one she'd seen again on the silver buckle of the cowboy who'd tried to marry her. Now she knew why her heart had stopped when he knelt. It wasn't fate. It was memory. She pressed her hands against her face, trembling. "It can't be," she whispered. "He wouldn't remember me. Not after all these years." Outside, branches cracked in the wind. She froze, listening. A horse snorted nearby, the sound faint but close. She rose slowly, heart pounding, and peeked through the cracks in the wooden wall. The moonlight fell across the clearing, and there he was, standing beside his horse, head bowed, holding her torn shawl in his hand. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he looked toward the cabin, his expression unreadable. He didn't call her name. He didn't move closer. He just stood there, as if afraid one wrong step might send her running again. Inside, her breath came shallow. Part of her wanted to scream, to demand the truth. Another part wanted to listen, to hear his side, to see if maybe the story she'd told herself all these years was wrong. But the image of her brother's lifeless eyes wouldn't leave her. He took a slow step forward, the wood creaking under his boots. "You don't have to hide," he said softly, his voice carrying across the clearing. "I ain't here to hurt you." She pressed her back against the wall, gripping the edge of the hearth poker with both hands. "Then why are you following me?" she whispered, though she knew he could barely hear. "Because you ran from something that ain't true," he said after a pause. "And I need you to hear what really happened." She swallowed hard. The fire crackled beside her. He stopped just a few feet from the door, waiting. "You think you know me?" he continued, his tone quiet but strained. "But the man you remember from that night, he's dead." "The one who fired that shot wasn't me," she didn't answer. The wind howled through the trees, shaking the loose boards of the cabin. He stepped closer to the door, hand still at his side. "I tried to save your brother," he said, his voice rough. "But by the time I reached him, he was already gone. The fire took everything after that. I carried that scar because I pulled him from the barn myself." Her hands trembled. "You're lying." "I wish I was," he said quietly. "But there's a man out there who made me pay for something I never did. I lost my land, my family, everything. And now you're running from me for the same lie." The firelight flickered between them, shadows shifting across the walls. Neither moved for a long time. The truth hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. Finally, she whispered, "Then prove it." He looked at her through the open doorway, the wind lifting the rain-soaked ends of his hair. "I intend to," he said. "But once I do, you won't ever see me the same again." Outside, thunder rolled across the valley once more. The night grew darker, and somewhere beyond the hills, the echo of another horse carried through the rain, another rider coming fast, one whose arrival would change everything before dawn. The next morning came quiet and gray, the kind of stillness that settles after a storm but before the world feels safe again. Mist hung over the trees like smoke, and the cabin by the river looked half lost in it. The girl hadn't slept at all. She sat on the floor near the cold hearth, arms wrapped around her knees, her mind tangled with memories she didn't want to face. The cowboy was still outside, leaning against a post, his hat low over his eyes. He hadn't tried to come in again, not after what he said, but his presence hung in the air, steady and patient, like a shadow that refused to leave. Inside, the girl kept replaying his words. "I tried to save your brother." They didn't fit with what she remembered. That night had been nothing but fire, shouting, and gunshots. She'd seen a man running through the flames and she'd sworn she recognized him. But what if she'd been wrong? What if the truth was something worse? Something she hadn't understood? Her heart said to run again, but something else deep inside told her to listen. Maybe it was the way his voice broke when he spoke, or the way he hadn't raised a hand even when she screamed. There was pain in him, yes, but not the kind born of guilt. It was the kind born of carrying a burden too long. Out in the yard, the cowboy built a small fire, his movements slow and careful. He didn't want to spook her again. He'd spent the whole night thinking about how to reach her, how to make her believe what really happened. But time had turned truth into something fragile, and the line between memory and guilt had blurred too much. He still remembered that night, the fire spreading through the barn, the sound of horses kicking and the scream that tore through the smoke. He'd found her brother inside, trapped under a beam, blood pooling beneath him. The boy had begged him to save the girl. He'd tried, but when the beam gave way, it crushed them both. He'd pulled the boy out only to realize it was too late. Then the sheriff had arrived, seen the gun in his hand, and made up his mind before asking a single question. From that night on, the cowboy had been a marked man. Now, years later, the past had circled back, through the girl who looked so much like her brother, through the scream that ripped the silence of Willow Creek. Around midday, the sound of another horse echoed through the valley. The cowboy stiffened, his hand instinctively brushing the handle of his revolver. He knew that sound. The sheriff's horse had a broken shoe that clicked every few strides. The law had found them. The girl heard it too. She moved to the window, peeking through the cracks. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice shaking. He didn't look at her. "I know. Did you tell them where I was?" she asked, her tone sharp now, the fear turning back into anger. He finally turned his head, meeting her eyes. "I told no one, but they'd come either way. Willow Creek's small, and folks talk." She stared at him for a long time. "Then what happens now?" He gave a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Now we both face what we've been running from." By the time the sheriff arrived, the rain had started again. He dismounted and looked around, his face grave. "You've got the whole town whispering, boy," he said quietly. "What happened in that chapel spooked more than just the girl." The cowboy didn't move. "She's here," he said. "But you ain't taking her." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Ain't my intention. I just need to hear the truth before someone gets hurt." Inside, the girl stayed near the window, listening. Her heart raced as she watched the two men. One she barely knew, and one she thought she could trust once. The sheriff looked around the clearing, then back at the cowboy. "You told me once you'd never kneel again before anyone," he said. "But the whole town saw you on your knee in that chapel." The cowboy nodded. "And I meant every word of it." "Then why'd she scream?" the sheriff asked. "You do something you're not telling me?" The cowboy's jaw tightened. "No, but she saw something in me she wasn't ready for." The sheriff sighed. "That's a fine way to dodge a question." He took a slow step closer. "You got enemies still? The kind that'd make a woman afraid to be near you?" "Too many," the cowboy said. "And one of them's riding this way." The sheriff frowned. "Who?" The cowboy didn't answer, but his eyes flicked toward the ridge above the river. The sheriff followed his gaze and saw it then, a dark figure on horseback watching from a distance. The rider wore a long coat and a wide hat, and even from far away, something about his stillness felt wrong. The girl saw him too. Her breath caught. "That man," she whispered, stepping closer to the window. "He was there that night." The cowboy looked up sharply. "You sure?" She nodded. "I remember that hat. He was the one shouting orders when the barn burned." The sheriff turned toward her voice, his expression shifting. "Then it ain't just a ghost story, is it?" he said. "Someone wants to keep the past buried." The cowboy's hand tightened around his revolver. They failed once. They won't this time. The sheriff gave a grim nod. You stay put. I'll ride up and have a word. But before he could mount his horse, a gunshot cracked across the valley. The bullet struck the fence post beside him, splintering it in two. The sheriff dove for cover, cursing under his breath. Guess talking's off the table, he shouted. The girl screamed and ducked. The cowboy moved fast, grabbing her arm and pulling her down beside the hearth. Stay low, he said. Who is he? She cried. The reason your brother's dead, he said quietly. Another shot rang out, this one hitting the doorframe. The sheriff fired back, but the shooter had already moved. The sound of hooves retreated up the ridge, fading into the rain. When the silence returned, it felt heavier than before. The sheriff stood slowly, brushing the mud from his coat. He'll be back, he said. Men like that don't miss twice. The cowboy nodded. Then we move before dark. The girl looked between them. Move where? I can't keep running forever. He met her eyes. You don't have to, but you need to know the truth first. About your brother, about me, and about the man who just tried to kill us all. The sheriff looked uneasy. You sure that's a story she's ready for? The cowboy gave a hard look. Ready or not, she's already living in it. They packed quickly. Some bread, a blanket, a small lamp. The girl hesitated before stepping outside, the wet earth sucking at her boots. The river glimmered behind the trees, and somewhere beyond it, a hawk cried. She felt the weight of everything closing in. The confusion, the fear, and the strange pull she felt toward the man beside her. As they mounted their horses, the sheriff spoke again. I'll take the lower trail and draw his eye. You two ride west toward Dry Valley. There's an old line shack there he won't expect. The cowboy nodded. You sure you'll make it? I've lived through worse, the sheriff said, swinging onto his horse. But if I don't show by sunrise, you ride like hell and don't look back. They parted ways at the bend. The rain came harder now, soaking through coats and saddles, blurring the world into shades of gray. The girl rode close behind the cowboy, watching the way he moved. Calm, steady, as if the storm itself couldn't shake him. She wondered what kind of man lived through so much loss, and still had enough left to protect someone who doubted him. As dusk fell, they reached the edge of Dry Valley. The ruins of the old ranch stood in the distance, black against the fading light. The girl's throat tightened. This is where it happened, she said softly. He nodded, dismounting. Yeah, right here. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of old ash and rain. The walls were half gone, the barn just a skeleton of charred beams. He walked slowly through the remains, each step stirring ghosts from the dust. I buried him there, he said, pointing to a small rise near the fence. Didn't even have time to mark the grave. Sheriff came before I could speak a word. She followed him, her eyes searching the ground. Why didn't you tell anyone? Would have done no good, he said. When a man's got blood on his hands, folks don't care whose it is. She crouched beside the grave, her fingers brushing the wet soil. If what you're saying is true, then the man who shot him is still out there. He is, the cowboy said quietly. And he's coming for us both. The sound of thunder rolled again. But it wasn't the storm this time. It was hooves, fast and closing. The cowboy looked toward the ridge, his eyes narrowing. The girl rose to her feet, her heart pounding. He reached for his revolver and turned toward her. No matter what happens, he said, his voice low and steady. You run when I say. She nodded, her breath trembling. The first flash of lightning lit the valley, and through the rain, the shadow of a rider appeared on the hilltop. The past had finally caught up to them, and it wasn't done yet. The wind cut through the valley like a blade, bending the dry grass and rattling the old boards of what was left of the barn. The girl stood near the half-collapsed fence, clutching her shawl around her shoulders as rain began to fall again in slow, heavy drops. The cowboy stood a few feet away, his eyes fixed on the ridge where the dark rider loomed against the lightning-split sky. The sound of the approaching horse grew louder, sharper until even the air seemed to tremble with each hoofbeat. He didn't say a word. He just lowered his hat, tightened his grip on the revolver, and took a slow step forward. The girl wanted to speak, to tell him not to do this alone, but something in his stance stopped her. It was the stillness of a man who'd already made his peace with whatever came next. The thunder cracked again, closer this time, and the rider's silhouette grew clearer, tall, broad-shouldered, the coat flapping in the wind like a torn flag. Then, as the rider reached the edge of the valley, he pulled his horse to a halt. The silence that followed felt heavier than the storm. For a moment, neither man moved. The girl's breath caught when she saw a glint of metal under the stranger's coat. A rifle, old but well kept. The cowboy's voice came low. "You got two choices," he called out. "Turn around and ride out of this valley, or face what you should have faced years ago." The rider laughed, the sound rough and hollow. "Still talking like a hero, aren't you?" His voice echoed through the valley, familiar yet distant. "You always were too proud to admit what you'd done." The girl's stomach twisted. She knew that voice. It was the same one that shouted commands the night her brother died. Her fingers tightened on the fence. The cowboy didn't answer. He just raised his gun slightly, not to shoot, but to let the man know he was ready. "Put it down," the rider said coldly. "You're not walking away this time. You ran once, left everything burning behind you. But this time there's nowhere to run." "I didn't run," the cowboy said. His voice was calm, steady as the rain. "I buried your work. I buried your lies. And I'll do it again if I have to." The girl stepped closer, her heart pounding. "Who is he?" she whispered. The cowboy's eyes didn't leave the figure on the hill. "The man who started it all," he said softly. "The one who burned the ranch." The rider shifted in the saddle. "That's rich," he said, sneering. "You blaming me now? I told you to leave the land when the deal turned bad. You wouldn't listen. You always thought you could fight the kind of men who buy sheriffs and silence witnesses." "You mean the kind of man who shoots a boy in the back?" the cowboy said. "You can dress it up however you like, but that's what you did." The rider laughed again, cold and bitter. "That boy got himself killed because he couldn't mind his own business. Just like his sister here." The girl froze. Her hand covered her mouth. "He knew my brother," she whispered. The cowboy turned slightly, his jaw set. "He did more than know him," he said. "He killed him." Before she could answer, the rider moved. His horse lunged forward, hooves pounding against the soaked ground. The cowboy fired once, the shot cracking like lightning. The rider ducked low, the bullet missing by inches as he rode past, circling around. The girl screamed and dropped to the ground as splinters flew from the fence beside her. The cowboy ran for the cover of the barn ruins, reloading fast, his breath sharp in the cold air. The rider pulled up near the river, using the rocks for cover, his rifle glinting in the flashes of lightning. For a few moments, all she could hear was the rain and the echo of their breathing. Then came another shot, this one close enough to tear a chunk from the wooden beam beside the cowboy's shoulder. He ducked low, eyes darting toward the girl. "Stay down," he shouted. She crawled behind the fallen wagon, the mud soaking her dress. She tried not to cry, but every gunshot made her flinch. The sheriff's words came back to her. "Men like that don't miss twice." The cowboy fired again, this time aiming for the sound of the horse. The animal reared, neighing in panic, and the rider cursed, taking cover behind the rocks. Rain poured harder now, turning the ground to a slick mess. The girl could barely see through the mist, but she caught a glimpse of the cowboy moving along the barn wall, his steps slow and quiet. He was circling, using the darkness to his advantage. Then a flash of lightning lit the valley, and she saw something else, a second rider coming down the far side of the hill. Her breath caught in her throat. "There's another one!" she shouted. The cowboy turned sharply. "Where?" "There." She pointed toward the ridge, her voice trembling. "He's coming fast!" He cursed under his breath. He brought help. The second man rode hard, a rifle slung across his chest. The first rider whistled, signaling him, and soon the two men were closing in from opposite sides. The girl ducked lower, clutching the edge of the wagon as bullets tore through the air again. The cowboy moved quick, firing twice and ducking behind a broken wall. One bullet hit its mark. The second rider fell from his horse, rolling hard into the mud. The first shouted something furious and aimed again, but the rain blurred his aim. For a moment, everything felt like chaos. The thunder, the rain, the smell of gunpowder mixing with wet earth. The girl's heart pounded so loud she could hardly hear her own thoughts. Then silence fell again. The rider by the rocks was gone from sight. The cowboy stepped out slowly, his revolver raised, scanning the dark. The girl crawled forward, mud streaking her face. "Where is he?" she whispered. "Gone to reload," he muttered. "He won't leave without finishing this." "Then what do we do?" He looked at her with steady eyes. "We end it before he does." The girl shook her head. "You'll get yourself killed!" He almost smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Maybe. But I won't let him take anyone else." Before she could stop him, he moved toward the river, his steps careful, his revolver low. She followed at a distance, her heart hammering. The air smelled of rain and metal, the world wrapped in shadow and tension. When she reached the riverbank, she saw him standing face to face with the rider. The man had dismounted, his rifle resting against his shoulder. "So," the rider said, his voice steady now, "this is where it ends. You should have left when I told you. Could have had a life. Instead, you dragged this girl into it too." "She deserves the truth," the cowboy said quietly. "You owe her that much," the rider tilted his head. "Truth? The truth won't change what's coming." The girl stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "Tell me why you killed him. Tell me why my brother had to die." The rider turned, the faintest smirk curling his lips. "Because he saw what he wasn't supposed to see. He saw me burning the land for men who wanted it empty. Your brother tried to stop me. He didn't understand that everything in this valley was already bought and paid for, including him." The cowboy's jaw tightened. "You killed a good man for greed." "No," the rider said, raising his rifle. "I killed him because you hesitated. You were supposed to keep him out of the barn, but you froze. You remember that, don't you?" The cowboy's face went pale. "You set me up." The girl's heart twisted as she looked between them. "He's lying," she said, her voice cracking. But the cowboy didn't answer. His mind was spinning back to that night, the flames, the chaos, the moment of hesitation when he'd seen the boy run toward the fire. He'd shouted, but the wind had swallowed his voice. For years he'd blamed himself. Now he knew why. The rider saw it too, the flicker of doubt, and raised his rifle higher. "You're not the hero she thinks you are," he said coldly. "You're just the man who watched her brother die." Lightning split the sky and the rider fired. The girl screamed as the shot echoed through the valley. The cowboy dove aside, rolling through the mud as the bullet tore through his coat. He fired back, the sound thunderous in the rain. The rider stumbled, dropping his rifle but not falling. The girl ran forward, grabbing the fallen gun and pointing it with trembling hands. "Stop!" she cried. "No more!" Both men froze. The wind howled between them, carrying the smell of rain and gun smoke. The rider straightened slowly, blood streaking his arm. "You think you can end this girl?" he said, laughing quietly. "You have no idea what's waiting beyond this valley." She held the rifle tighter, her breath shaking. "I don't care. I just want it to end." The cowboy looked at her, then at the man who'd haunted them both. The storm swelled around them, thunder rolling like drums of war. And in that suspended second, between breath and gunfire, between past and truth, the three of them stood locked in a circle of ghosts, each one waiting for the other to make the final move. The rain poured harder, lightning flashed across the sky, and somewhere in the distance a single horse neighed as if sensing what was about to come. The rifle trembled in the girl's hands as the rain came down harder, blurring the edges of everything. The cowboy stood bleeding and unsteady, mud streaking his face, eyes locked on the man across from him. The rider's smirk faded as he realized she wasn't backing down. The air between them was so tight it felt like even the thunder was holding its breath. Then the cowboy spoke, low and steady. "Put it down, miss," he said gently. "You don't need to carry this weight. It ain't yours." But she shook her head, tears cutting lines through the dirt on her cheeks. "He took my brother's life," she whispered. "And he ruined yours," the rider laughed, weak but cruel. "You think pulling that trigger will bring him back?" He said, "Go on then, find out." For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. The lightning flashed, turning everything silver and ghost-like. Then slowly the cowboy stepped forward and placed his hand over the barrel of the rifle. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "Don't do what I almost did," he said. "Don't let hate turn you into what you're fighting." Her hands trembled harder, then slowly lowered the gun. She stepped back, sobbing quietly, and the cowboy turned his gaze toward the man who'd hunted him for years. "You're done running," he said. The rider sneered, even as blood soaked through his coat. "You think this changes anything? They'll come for you both. This valley, that land, you don't know who it belongs to anymore." "Maybe not," the cowboy said. "But I know who it doesn't belong to, you." And with that he struck. The two men collided hard, falling into the mud. The gun went off once more, a deafening crack that echoed across the valley. When the smoke cleared, the rider lay still, the rain washing the blood from his sleeve into the dirt. The cowboy stood above him, breathing heavy, chest rising and falling like he'd just finished carrying years of guilt up a mountain. The girl stared at the lifeless man for a long time. It didn't feel like victory, just silence, the kind that settles after too much pain. She turned toward the cowboy, who was swaying on his feet, his face pale. "You're hurt," she said, running to him. He shook his head weakly. "It's nothing. Just grazed." But when she looked closer, she saw the dark patch spreading beneath his shirt. He tried to smile, but it faltered. "Guess I'm not as quick as I used to be." "Sit down," she said firmly, guiding him toward the broken fence. She tore a strip from her shawl and pressed it against the wound, her hands shaking but determined. He winced but didn't pull away. "You shouldn't have been here," he said. "You should have left when I told you, and let you die alone," she said sharply. "After everything you've done to protect me?" He tried to speak, but she shook her head again. "Don't you dare say I owe you nothing. You gave me the truth. That's more than anyone ever did." The rain slowed to a drizzle, and the storm began to fade into distant rumbles. The valley smelled of wet sage and smoke, the air heavy but cleaner somehow, as if the earth itself had sighed. The cowboy leaned back against the fence, closing his eyes for a moment. "Your brother was a good man," he said softly. "He stood up when no one else would. I owed it to him to tell you what really happened." She nodded, tears running silently down her face. "I know," she whispered. "I just wish he could have heard you say that." The sheriff arrived a few hours later, drawn by the echo of gunfire. He found them sitting side by side, the rain tapering to a soft mist. The rider's body lay still by the riverbank, his rifle half buried in the mud. The sheriff dismounted slowly, his eyes scanning the scene before settling on the cowboy. "So it's over," he said quietly. The cowboy nodded. "One way or another." The sheriff looked at the girl, then back at him. "Heard what happened from the preacher. Folks in Willow Creek are talking." "You saved her." The cowboy gave a tired smile. "Maybe she saved me." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You'll have to come back to town. There'll be questions, but I'll make sure they hear the right answers this time." The girl stood up, her clothes torn and soaked, her expression steady now. "I'll go with him," she said. "He's not facing this alone." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Didn't think you would." They buried the rider by the river at dawn. No one said much. The cowboy refused a marker, saying the land would remember well enough. The sky turned gold and pink as the first light touched the wet hills, and for the first time in years, the valley felt quiet again. No fire, no ghosts, just the sound of the wind moving through the grass. Back in Willow Creek, people lined the street when they rode in. The townsfolk who'd whispered behind fences now watched in silence as the sheriff led them to the chapel. The preacher stood waiting, his hands clasped, his eyes kind but heavy. "Seems the Lord works in strange ways," he said softly as the cowboy dismounted. "Always has," the cowboy said. The preacher looked at the girl, then back at him. "The truth's a heavy thing," he said. "But sometimes it's the only thing that sets a soul free." The cowboy nodded. "It cost me near everything, but I reckon it's worth it." The sheriff cleared his throat. "The townsfolk know what really happened now. About the fire, the land, all of it. You'll get your name back." The cowboy looked at the muddy street, his voice quiet. "I don't much care about a name anymore. I just want to live somewhere the past don't follow." The preacher smiled faintly. "Maybe that's not a place," he said. "Maybe that's just peace." They stayed in town that night. The girl sat by the window of the small inn, watching the rain start again, softer this time. The cowboy sat nearby, cleaning his revolver, though his hands were slower than usual. Neither spoke for a while. The silence between them wasn't uneasy. It was the kind that comes when words can't carry what hearts already know. Finally, she said, "What will you do now?" He looked out the window, his voice low. "There's a lot of land out west. Might be time I started fresh somewhere. Maybe build a place where the wind don't sound like the past." She smiled a little. "And you think you can just ride off and forget everything?" He glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "No, but I can try to make something good out of what's left." She looked down at her hands. "And if I wanted to come with you?" He went still for a moment, then met her eyes. "You sure about that? You've got a whole town here that'll treat you right. You don't owe me a thing." She shook her head gently. "Maybe not, but I don't belong here anymore. Not after everything that's happened. My family's gone. The only person who ever told me the truth is sitting right here." The cowboy's expression softened. "You don't know what life out there's like." "I've seen worse," she said quietly. "I'll take open land and honesty over whispers and pity." He studied her for a long time, then nodded. "All right, but it won't be easy." "Nothing worth it ever is," she replied. By morning, the sky was clear again. The mud had dried into hard cracks, and the valley shone under the rising sun. The two of them rode out of Willow Creek as the church bell rang once, a slow, echoing sound that followed them down the road. They didn't speak much. The land stretched wide and endless ahead of them, painted in gold and shadow. The girl glanced back only once, seeing the town fade into the distance, the chapel standing small but bright in the light. The cowboy looked over his shoulder and caught her gaze. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded. "For the first time, yes." He smiled, the kind of smile that came from somewhere deep and worn but still alive. "Then let's ride," and they did, two figures crossing into the far horizon, where the sky met the earth and the ghosts of the past finally loosened their hold. Behind them, Willow Creek slowly returned to its quiet ways. Folks spoke of the girl who faced her fears and the cowboy who found redemption. The preacher said sometimes justice doesn't come from law, but from the courage to face what's buried. And those who'd been there that stormy night swore that when the rain fell over the valley, it sounded softer, as if even the land had finally found peace. The ring that once lay in the mud by the chapel door was never found again, though some said the river carried it west, shining faintly under the water, waiting for new hands to find it, just like hope, moving quietly through time.